Hello. Oh, it's this one. Hello, hello. There we go. Pick a mic, any mic. Good morning, everyone. Oh, that was loud. Good morning. Welcome to Creative Mornings Edinburgh. It's so nice to see so many of you in person. I hope you've all managed to get a hot beverage. It is quite cool in here, but hopefully we'll warm up as the morning goes on. Um, I am going to start off by handing over to Julia from the Fruit Market, and she's going to tell us a little bit about the space we're in and about this wonderful installation that we're all sitting under.
Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to obviously the Fruit Market Gallery and to our new space, the warehouse. It's fantastic. This obviously was an old fruit market and now it's a gallery space. We have an exhibition on, it's an installation built just for this space by Jill Bradley. She was, so I'm trying to get away from the light. She was a wonderful artist, nominated for the Turner Prize. She does usually work outside, so this is quite an interesting new piece. It's called Par Days. It's basically all about the growing season in Scotland, all about orchards and things, and obviously it looks a bit like a greenhouse. She uses light, so perspex with light edged perspex. So basically it grabs all the lights of the space, pushes it out at the end to make a beautiful green colour. She wanted, as part of the exhibition, to have other things in the space to make it come alive. Obviously, things like yourself, what you're doing here today. We've had gigs on, we've had beautiful dance, an ensemble, we've even had, I teach yoga here, we're teaching yoga and things like that for the public. So, as I say, welcome to the space. Have a great morning, and I say thank you very much for thinking of us. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Julia. So welcome to our slightly belated March Creative Mornings Edinburgh event. For those of you who might have been here before, I'm sure you know what we're all about, but if not, if this is your first Creative Mornings, welcome and thank you for being here. Creative Mornings is an international community, and our kind of core belief about what we do is that everyone is creative. So no matter what walk of life you come from, no matter what your job is, your outside interests, we believe that everyone is creative and everybody has something amazing to bring to this community. So thank you all for being here. Creative Mornings Edinburgh is one of 223 chapters around the world, in cities all over the world, 67 countries. I'm sure that 27,000 attendees per month is going up, and over 9,000 talks online as well. So you can watch Creative Mornings from all over the world on the Creative Mornings website as well, so you don't have to just stick with us here in Edinburgh. And there's a wealth of incredible talks and speakers from all over the globe. So your Creative Mornings Edinburgh is brought to you by the team who are here this morning. So you've got myself, Rebecca, and we've got Matt, we've got Sarah, Rita, and Laura as well in the room. They'll be here with us all this morning, making sure that you feel comfortable and that everything goes smoothly this morning, I hope. We are a team of volunteers, and like the rest of the community, we all come from lots of different disciplines, different backgrounds, and we are always on the lookout for new, lovely people to join our team as well. So if you've got an interest in joining the Creative Mornings team, then please do get in touch. You can either get in touch with us on social media, or our email is edinburgh@creativemornings.com. So drop us a line, say hello, tell us what you're about, and we'd love to meet you. Lovely. So every month at Creative Mornings, we have a different global theme, and the chapters around the world are open to interpret this theme in whatever way they like. And March's theme is folklore. So folklore for Creative Mornings, it's all about how vast the universe is and how full of mysteries it is as well. As a species, humankind spins stories to answer these mysteries without answers. As these stories are passed down among a people, they become folklore. So things like, who put the stars up there? When a pot breaks, who might be the unseen culprit? How do we celebrate the successes we can't take credit for? Folklore exercises our mythic imagination, all that magical stuff that happens inside us. And it's our way of seeing beyond the tangible to make sense of the enigmatic and the unfathomable of our world. So every month, a different chapter chooses our theme, and folklore was chosen by the Guatemala City chapter. And was illustrated beautifully here by artist Sarah Ortega. And if you want to see more of her work and find out a little bit more about what she's all about, you can head to the Creative Mornings website. As a global organisation, we have a global sponsor as well, and we like to just give a little bit of a nod to them, and that is MailChimp. And MailChimp are one of the leading resources for freelancers and small businesses to help with their marketing and kind of online presence. And something they want us to share with you this month is a project they did in association with Courier Magazine. I love Courier Magazine. It's all about kind of modern business and the future of how we're working and living together. And they ran this project called 25 Lessons to Make It Big, where they spoke to small business owners and freelancers from all around the world about how they've been doing over the last couple of years. So if you head to the Creative Mornings website again, you can find out a little bit more about the lessons they've learned from the last couple of years about sustainability in their business, about the changes they're making, and what their hopes for the future are as well. So I'm sure there's a lot of great creative juice and ideas to get out of that. We are also really fortunate here at Creative Mornings Edinburgh to be supported by Free Agent. Free Agent are one of the leading accountancy software organisations for freelancers, as I'm sure many of us are. And they are kind of here to help businesses in Edinburgh kind of get the most out of what they do. So again, Free Agent sponsor us every month, and we're really, really grateful to them. And you can check them out social media and online as well. So please do if you are a freelancer and you're looking for some help. And just before we go on to the kind of main portion of our talk as well, you'll have seen on our social media channels and also as well elsewhere on Creative Mornings, that obviously we are thinking a lot about what's happening in Ukraine at the moment, and a little update from Creative Mornings HQ is that they've been in touch with the chapters in Kyiv and also in Lviv as well, and that everybody is doing okay, and they just wanted us to be able to share that with our chapters as well as a bit of an update. Obviously it's a ever-changing and ever-changing situation. And they'll be making an effort to kind of keep in touch with the chapters as things kind of develop. And if you want to find out a little bit more about what Creative Mornings are doing and also how you can help and support and some really, really great and reliable news sources as well, then you can head to the Creative Mornings website, and there's a whole resource page provided by the folks at the Kyiv chapter as well if you want to find out a little bit more about how you can support. So that leads me to our kind of main event, definitely for today, which is our speaker, Rachel Plummer. And Rachel's talk is going to be entitled Exploring Identity Through Folklore. And I'll tell you a little bit about Rachel before they come up. So Rachel is a poet, a storyteller, and a children's writer. They're a Scottish Book Trust New Writers Award recipient, and their work has been published in journals and anthologies including Dyslexia, The Dark Horse, Shoreline of Infinity, and New Writing Scotland. They are the author of Wayne, a book of LGBT reimaginings of Scottish folklore for young people, published by the Emma Press, and they were awarded a cultural commission by LGBT Youth Scotland for this project. Rachel lives in Edinburgh with her 2 young children, 3 guinea pigs, and entirely too many books, which I say is something you can definitely never have. After Rachel has spoken, we're going to open up the floor to some questions, but without further ado, please welcome Rachel Plummer.
Hello. I'm just going to pop these down here, if that's okay. It's lovely to be here. I'm going to drag this out a little bit. I'm going to sit down for most of this, because the reason why this had to be rescheduled was that I was not very well, and I'm better now, but still a bit wobbly in a kind of post-COVID way. But yes, hello, and thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be here. This is such a lovely space to come and be in, both physically and kind of socially. It's lovely to be around other creatives, isn't it? And to to have that energy and that atmosphere. I think I'm definitely going to go away from this feeling really inspired. So let's get into it. I was so delighted to be asked to talk about folklore because it's something I love very much. I'm not an expert, so let me just tell you that right at the start. I'm not an expert, just kind of an enthusiast, someone who loves folklore very much. But I'll talk a little bit about that. So I'm, as has been mentioned, I'm a poet and a storyteller, a writer. I live in Edinburgh. Primarily I write poems for grown-ups. Wayne is actually my first book for young people. And that was actually really lovely because books for young people have pictures and books for grown-ups tend not to. And I was very excited that this book has pictures, and they're by an artist called Helena Boppert, who is an incredible artist. And so that was really exciting. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about my book and how I came to write it, and the kind of story behind that. And then I'm going to talk about folklore and what it is and how we can use it in our creative practice, with a particular focus on using it to think about identity. And then there'll be a time to ask questions. And I'm used to presenting this content, exploring identity through folklore, as a workshop. So normally I do it with people like around a big table and we talk about it. So it's going to be a bit strange to be kind of just me talking without much feedback from you guys until the end. But I'm hoping that maybe you'll have some thoughts about it in your head, and if you really disagree with some of the things I'm saying, I think that's going to be really interesting. And normally I would love to hear that, so if you want to share that at the end, I'd love to hear that too. A lot of the things that we're going to talk about with regards to folklore, with regards to poetry, with regards to storytelling, there's no one definitive answer, and that's one of the things I really like about it. So I'll start off talking about Wayne. So as I mentioned, I'm a storyteller. I do a lot of storytelling. I love telling stories of all different kinds. And I have 2 children, and my daughter's 10, and when she was younger, she particularly loved stories about Scottish folklore, the Scottish kind of myths and legends and stories. And I think part of that was because a lot of them are quite dark and unpleasant. And she really liked that. That was her kind of thing. She likes kind of a dark, scary story. But what we found, sorry, I knew I would do that. I'm a queer parent. We have sometimes called rainbow families. We come from a queer family. So we found that in the stories that we were telling and sharing, and even in the children's books that we were reading, there weren't a lot of families like ours and people like us within that. And the books that we did find, the stories that we did find that contained LGBT people, tended to be more a kind of guide to what a queer person was. So it was, like, this is little Susie who has 2 mummies, but don't be mean to Susie at school, or any of the other unfortunate children. And I think those are important, they have a place, but it wasn't what we were looking for, and it was kind of meaningless to my daughter, who already knew what queer people were because that was her life and her family and her situation. And we wanted stories where queer people would just simply existed within them and as part of the world of the story. So I started gender swapping some of the characters as I was telling the stories, just to make it more representative of us and the people we knew and our friends and family. And after a while of doing that, I started to think that maybe other people might be interested in that too. So I started writing some of these poems, and I'm a poet, so they ended up as poems when they were written down. And then I applied to LGBT Youth for a cultural commission and was awarded the cultural commission and began to seriously work on Wayne. So that's a little bit about how that came about. When I was writing it, I specifically and consciously didn't use any of those terms like gay, lesbian, transgender, asexual, any of those, bisexual, any of those terms. Because I think even for children, there's a lot of baggage often with some of those terms, and I didn't want them to bring that as much as possible. I wanted them to approach these pieces free of any expectations of what they were about. And in fact, when we were developing a resource pack to go into schools, I was really keen, alongside the book, I was really keen for it to specifically state that teachers shouldn't tell the children what the poems and stories were about, or it shouldn't say, you know, this is about a gay parent, or this is about this, because I wanted the children to be able to decide that for themselves, even if what they decided was different to what their teacher thought or what I intended when I wrote it. I think that's really fine. As you might have gathered by now, I'm quite comfortable with things being a bit unsure and having different interpretations of things, and that was what I wanted. I wanted the children to come to it and have their own interpretation, to be able to read it and maybe see themselves in a story, and their own family in a story, and then to be able to, from that point, to find empathy. This was kind of inspired by, in 2016, there was a survey that LGBT Youth Scotland did of Scottish queer young people, mostly like late teens, early 20s, to ask about their experiences. And some of the comments on that said that what they wanted and what they thought would help them was more LGBT representation, but not just for them, but for straight cis people as well, so that the first time they were encountering the idea of a trans person or the idea of a gay person wasn't that person at school, but that it was already kind of something that existed within their world and they were already aware of it, and that was fine. So that's my approach to the stories. So what I think I'm going to do, I'm going to share a couple of the poems, just so you have an idea of what I'm talking about, because maybe this all sounds a bit abstract, and that will give you an idea of what I mean. So I'll start with the first poem that I wrote for the collection. So it's the first poem in the book, and it's about the selkie. Do all of you know what a selkie is? Does anybody not really know? Yeah, okay. Well, I'll explain. It's totally fine to not know what any of these are. In the back of the book, there's a little kind of very simple, short glossary of the different stories and terms. But in Scottish folklore, a selkie is a creature that's a seal that lives in the sea, and when it comes out of the sea, it can take off its seal skin, and there's a human underneath, often a woman. But then it can put its sealskin back on and go back into the water and be a seal again. In many of the stories, the sealskin is taken away and hidden by somebody who wants to keep the selkie trapped on land. So this poem is called Selkie. The secret me is a boy. He takes girlness off like a sealskin, something that never sat right on his shoulders. The secret me is broad-shouldered. The sea can't contain him. The land can't anchor his waves to its sand. The secret me swims with the big fish. Brash, he swaggers like a mermaid, bears teeth like daggers, barks at the moon when it's thin. He's whiskered, that boy, thick-skinned, quick-finned, always turning tail. He wears his own skin like a sail, lets it carry him to where salt swallows mouthfuls of air. Let them find me there, by the shore, the girl seal with a secret boy inside. Rough-voiced, black-eyed, washed bare as the beach by the tide. So the next one I'm going to read is about the Finfolk. Finfolk are a little bit easier to explain because they're essentially Scotland's answer to mermaids. Here we go. So they are basically mermaids. They live in the sea, in the water. In many of the stories, they're trying to find a human spouse and steal one away. Often somebody who's married or engaged to a human. They try and steal them away to be their own spouse. Some of the stories say that if they don't marry a human, then their power and their beauty changes and they become kind of monstrous and live in the sea. In this poem, it's called Finfolkahim, which is the name of the Finfolk's palace under the sea, where they live. So, Finfolkahim. Once I loved a human boy, but that was long ago, before the sea scattered its silver coins on the coast at Ainhallow, filling my purse. Once I loved a Finwife, and her love was a transformation. I grew gills, a shiny tail, fish-scaled, leafy as a dragon. That was how much I loved her. So much that I breathed water and spoke coral and swam. So much that I forsook the land and went home with her to the Finnfolk's palace on the seabed, Finnfolkahim. It glowed with the light of 1,000 phosphorescent creatures. It swayed like a drowned woman's hair. It sang like the sea in an empty conch shell. I held it to my ear. Once I loved a human boy and loved the land he walked on, his 2 feet, his strong legs, the hill that was our home. But time came like a tide, eroding life's bedrock and flooding me with the possibility of mermaids. I have another poem, one last one that I'll share with you. No book, I think, of Scottish folklore and myth is complete without a nod to the Loch Ness Monster, to Nessie. And so I wrote this poem, Nessie, in which I've imagined a non-binary Nessie. So Nessie. The Loch Ness Monster isn't a boy or a girl. Nessie doesn't have much use for words like that. Nessie's much too busy scaring fishermen and posing for blurry photos that nobody will believe in. Nessie knows who Nessie is and isn't. Nessie knows where the silverest fish swim and how to shimmy through silt like a conga. Nessie knows what it's like to be the only one. You don't need to believe in Nessie. Your belief doesn't change who Nessie is. Under the weight of the water, under the shadow of the hills, Nessie has always existed. Not a boy or a girl, but real. So hopefully that gives you an idea of what I mean when I'm talking about LGBT reimaginings of folklore and putting those into poetry, which I know is maybe something of an abstract concept until you hear the poems themselves. So let's talk about folklore and what it is and how we can use it. So at this point, I would normally ask you, what is folklore? What do you think folklore is? So I wish I could do that just now, but maybe at the end you can give me some answers to that. The dictionary says that the folklore is the traditional beliefs, customs, and stories of a community passed through the generations by word of mouth. And Wikipedia, very reliable, says that folklore is the body of culture shared by a particular group of people. It encompasses the traditions common to that culture, subculture, or group. This includes oral traditions such as tales, legends, proverbs, and jokes. So I like both those definitions. I think those are quite good. I think it can be easier to say what folklore is and harder to draw a line at the edges of it, like with so many things. Say what when we get to these edge cases, what counts as folklore and what doesn't, and who gets to decide that. And I don't really know. I think for me, I'd say that folklore is a lot like poetry, in that it's really hard to define. And maybe it's something that's more like, we know it when we see it. We have this gut feeling, and that's going to be different for different people. So what's folklore to you might not be the same as what's folklore to somebody else, or what counts as folklore. And that's okay. That's okay for me. I mean, maybe you're somebody who really likes things to be in a set category and likes to kind of neatly put things into a category, and that's fine too. But for me, I think it's quite interesting. I really like these things that are hard to define. I think one of the edge cases can be fairy tales. Maybe you could put your hand up, and that will give me an idea. Put your hand up if you think fairy tales are folklore, if you do. And put your hand up if you think fairy tales are not folklore. So all of you think that they do count as folklore. That's really interesting. I think for me too, they sort of fall under the umbrella of folklore. I think the main difference tends to be that fairy tales tend to be written down, although they might have many different versions, many different authors. And folklore tends to be something that's evolved over many generations and many different groups of people, maybe over quite a wide geographical area too. And over the years it's really changed, and that you couldn't really point to one or even more than one person and say they were the author of it and they were the originator of it. And fairy tales tend to be a little bit more epic in scope, maybe. When we think of folk tales in particular, we think maybe of more, although they can often still contain magic, they may be more everyday. Yeah, it's interesting. I think they're both part of folklore, folk tales and fairy tales. But I think I would say there's a difference. My background is in science, particularly in nuclear astrophysics, and I came a long way from there to writing poetry. But for me, I often say that science and folklore can occupy a similar cultural space. So they're both ways that we have of talking about life and the world and the universe. And as you said, about explaining things like what are the stars, or why are the seasons? And I think they're both ways of thinking about that, stories that we can tell to explain that. There's this great human preoccupation with these things and with these stories. So I think that's part of why folklore is inspiring to artists and creatives. And I think another part of it is that there's a connection there to our community, to our own personal past, our childhoods often. Often folklore is one of the first encounters we have with art and with stories and with creating. And I think so there's a link to our own personal past, but also to the past in general. There's something that's been passed from person to person, and stories have been told since before there was writing. Since, almost as long as there's been language, as long as there's been people. And it gives us a connection to that. So I think that's another part of why folklore is inspiring to artists. But it also gives us a connection to other creatives and to creativity, both current ones and past ones. There are, all kinds of people around the world from different cultures and different places that have their own folklore that are creating and imagining based on that, and in many different art forms. So whether that's paintings or video games or stories, poems, any kind of form of art that you can think of, folklore tends to be involved in that in some way. There is always somebody from that discipline who has thought about folklore or brought elements of that in. And part of that is that it's one of our first influences. So most of us have heard folklore, fairy tales, folk tales. Most of us have been told these stories from our parents or our teachers from when we were very young. And that's even subconsciously going to influence our view of the world and our art. I think another reason why it can be really inspiring for us is that it's sort of a blank canvas, but with less pressure than a blank canvas. So you're not creating something entirely from scratch, but because everybody who tells or retells or reimagines one of these stories puts their own spin on it, and always has done, there's some creativity involved, even if you're just straight up telling the story and repeating it as you believe you've been told it. It still involves some creativity, but there's less pressure in that creativity than having to create a story or create something completely from scratch with no idea of where to start or what to do. And then as well, you have the audience familiarity with that source material, which you can play with. So you can subvert maybe the audience's expectations of that story, particularly with really well-known stories where you think in your culture, within the audience that you expect your art to have, most people are going to be aware of this story. So how are you going to use your art to touch on that? You can use elements of the symbolism of that, or you can mess with people's expectations and make it different and unexpected. So I think those are some of the reasons why folklore is really inspiring to a lot of artists. But how can we use folklore to explore aspects of our identity? So obviously that's something I do. That's what I love to do. I don't tend to write directly confessional poetry, that is poetry that's directly about myself. I think sometimes it can be really hard to write directly about your own experiences, for example, as a queer person. but folklore allows me to take stories or characters that resonate with some aspect of my identity, some aspect of my queerness, and to write about those experiences through that lens. So it's a way of writing about myself or aspects of myself and finding a way into that. And I think no matter what your identity is or what different parts of your identity you have, you can probably find aspects of some of these stories that resonate with you or that you identify with in some way. And it can be a way of exploring that part of your identity. So if we come back to the definition of folklore, so the beliefs, stories, and customs of a community, you can also think about the communities that you're part of. So for me, maybe that's that I'm part of the LGBT community. That's just one of the communities that I'm part of. And these communities will have their own folklore, if that makes sense. So we go back to that definition about it being the body of culture shared by a group of people encompassing traditions common to that culture, subculture, or group. So whatever communities you're part of, they are going to have their own folklore, and maybe you're part of creating that folklore. And that folklore is worth creating and preserving and talking about. So as well as that, and alongside that, people from marginalized communities and identities are part of the wider community that we're in as well. And our identities and voices also deserve representation within the folklore of our wider community. So for example, there are LGBT people in the world. They should also be in the stories and the culture and the folklore that we're telling, the folk tales. They should exist within the universe of the stories that we tell. And often they were and have been taken out. When folklore started to be written down and anthologized, often it was for a more upper or middle class audience, often for a more conservative Christian audience, where historically it wasn't. It was something that was like commonly shared by everybody. And especially folklore from other cultures around the world, when it's been translated into English and anthologized into English, especially historical versions of that, it often has been kind of sanitized for the audience that it was intended to. And for example, queer people have been taken out of that. So when I was working on Wayne, actually, I often had people saying, well, don't you have to work quite hard or change the stories quite a lot to make them queer? And I would laugh because no, not at all, not at all. Often the queerness is already there, maybe in the subtext, and I'm bringing it to the text, but it really is already there. So let's think about retelling and reimagining folklore in the way that I've done, in the way that you might do, either as a writer or as some other kind of artist or creative. So there are many, many, many retellings, reimaginings of folklore throughout the ages and across different genres. So there's sci-fi retellings of folklore and horror and romance, fantasy, literary. There's stories that are set in the modern day or at some point in history or in another part of the world or in an alternate reality or in the future. It's really interesting. I teach creative writing to teenagers and young people, and often I ask them to retell fairy tales or folk tales. Recently I did this with my teen group, and I made a note of what they came up with because I thought it was quite interesting. They had a time-traveling Red Riding Hood who was her own grandma. So she was time-traveling to save herself. They had a social media Cinderella who was being bullied online by trolls. They had a conspiracy theorist, Chicken Little, which I thought was very apt. They had a robot gingerbread man who'd been created by the old man and the old woman. And they had a spaceship second in command, Snow White, who is trying to launch a coup against the captain, the queen, and she ends up befriending asteroid miners. So I thought those were really interesting, and I think there's sort of a world of possibility there, and each of those really made sense to me. There's a lot of possibility within retelling and reimagining folklore. And because I think one of the reasons there are so many reimaginings and retellings in so many different ways is thinking about who owns folklore. So this again would be the part where I'd ask you, what do you think about who owns folklore? We've talked about how it often doesn't have a single author. So each tale is instead the result of many people, many generations, across many places and many kind of incarnations. And it changes often with each telling and retelling. It's a living art form. It's often based in the oral tradition, so it's not written down, it's being told. So as a storyteller, every time I tell a story, even me telling the same story, it's going to be slightly different. It's going to be different depending on what point in my life I'm telling this story, what day I'm telling it, how I'm feeling, and what the audience is like. So I would change it depending on the audience. So each telling, even that I make, is slightly different, let alone when it's passed through person and person and person, and those are told and retold. I would maybe argue that folklore, it belongs to all of us. Certainly all of us from whatever culture that folklore comes from, that particular folklore comes from. So there's no right or wrong way to tell or retell these stories. But there's a line, it's often a blurry and a complicated line, between a retelling folklore and appropriation. So it's a bit of a blurry line. So I myself, I've faced this and thought about this a lot. My family are originally from mainland Europe. They moved to England during the Second World War. Well, they had to. They left. And then in my teens, I moved to Scotland. So I feel like I have a lot of places I'm from. My partner is Scottish, my children are Scottish, they're from here. And the Scottish stories were the ones we told, which is why we retold this, but I wasn't born in Scotland. How much claim do I have to Scottish folklore? It's a really interesting question, and again, I'm going to say there's not really an easy answer. There's not a really straightforward answer. I think this is one I would definitely say to beware of anybody who tries to tell you there's a really simple answer to this. So there's a big push against people in our culture only telling and retelling and popularizing stories from white European folklore and not including and not telling stories from other cultures. But then equally there's a push against people from our culture taking stories that are from cultures that maybe have been historically oppressed by us and then using them for our gain. So using them to write a best-selling book, and maybe that story is better told by somebody from that culture. And maybe we only have a superficial understanding of the kind of cultural context of that piece of folklore as well. So it's a really hard thing to balance, and my only advice to you would be, if that's a position you find yourself in, to be conscientious about it, to think about it and be intentional with what you're doing, and to approach it with humility, particularly to approach interactions with people from that culture who might have something to say about your interpretation of the folklore with some humility, and be open to talking about that, thinking about that, reading about that, and considering it. So, to finish before we have some questions, I'd say that folklore can be a really rich source of inspiration and material for your creative practice. And it can be a way to express and explore aspects of your own identity within your art, whatever that might be. Often it's one of our first encounters with art, so consciously or not, it can influence what we're creating for the rest of our lives. But when you discover new folklore, new to you folklore, that can open up new wells of potential inspiration and reserves of your creativity. And so it can challenge you as an artist, and it can also challenge your audience. I hope that you can find ways to include folklore in your creativity. I think you'll find it really rewarding. I'd like to end with another one of my poems, another one of my folklore retellings. This one's definitely kind of fairy tale retelling. And I don't think you particularly need to know the story behind this one. It's your typical dragon story. there's a princess, there's a dragon. And in the original story, the the princess's dad says that whatever knight from wherever around the world can kill the dragon will marry his daughter, and she doesn't really get much of a say in that. Nor does she get much of a say in being handed over to the dragon. So I wanted to give her a bit more agency and a name. So this poem is called Mairead. This is the way the world is, they said, as they rounded up all the young girls to feed to the dragon. There will always be dragons, and they will always be hungry, they said. Nothing to be done. This is the way the world is. The king wept as he gave up his daughter and thought it would be better to give her to a man than to a dragon. So he told all his knights that whoever killed the dragon would marry the rescued princess. Princesses never get to decide who they marry. This is also the way the world is, they said, as the men rounded up their big swords and their armor. Princesses are for rescuing and marrying, for dresses and looking pretty. Everybody knows it, except the princess. Her name was Mairead. Mairead had big leather boots to tuck daggers in. Mairead had a chainmail dress and a flame-proof hat. Mairead had stopped listening a while ago and was already climbing down the dragon's throat to stick a silver knife in its stomach. Ouch. This is the way the world is, Mairead said, when the dragon lay dead at her feet. Unpredictable, full of strength and fire. She told the other girls, "You are not princesses, but you are worth saving too. There will always be dragons. Marry whoever you like." Thank you very much.
Rachel, thank you so much.
Thank you.
What a wonderful way to end. We're going to open up the floor to questions.
Yeah.
And Rita is going to grab our little travelling microphone.
That's such a cool microphone.
Isn't it cool, bit of kit?
That's so cool.
So yeah, does anybody have any questions like to kick us off?
And you can ask questions about anything to do with folklore, my work, anything, or anything else if you want.
I know, Rachel, as well, you maybe had some questions for the audience as well.
Yeah, I did. But you had a question, the lady at the
Oh.
back. Is it a lady? I'm not sure. I cannot see at the back.
That was really good, thanks so much. It's more of around the definition. As a kid, I read a lot of Greek mythology, and there was some stuff to explain the seasons, of how things, would you say Greek, is mythology folklore? What's the kind of...
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question too. What do you all think? This is my standard response. What do you all think? Is mythology folklore? Put your hand up if you think mythology is folklore. Yeah, I think so. Does anyone think it's not folklore? It's fine to disagree. You don't have to agree with what everybody else says. That's totally fine. Yeah, I think it is a kind of folklore, but I think we have to be wary because it maybe crosses a line into religion as well. Is religion and religious stories folklore? Well, kind of. We talked about in the definition how it's to do with the beliefs and customs of a particular culture. So maybe there's, Christian folklore, folklore from various different cultures, but I think then when it comes to how we're reimagining that and rethinking of that, maybe we have to be a little wary of that. But I think there's been some really interesting queer reimagining of religious material. I'm thinking of like Joe Clifford's The Gospel According to Jesus Christ, like the one where she portrays Jesus Christ as a trans woman, and she has like a play of that. I think that I went to see that, it was so good and so challenging and received a lot of controversy. But yeah, so I think mythology definitely can be, especially, you think of Greek mythology, it's so pervasive. I think it's something that's influenced a lot of other folklore that's come after it in other locations, in other places. So yeah. Yep.
Hi, thank you so much. Like from my point of view, folklore, every time that I hear about it, is usually ancient stories and like whatnot, right? My question is, do you think that folklore is still being created presently, and where does it come from right now? Like, is it like, I don't know, Pixar movies or Disney stories, or like where is it coming from right now at the present?
Maybe. I think that's a super interesting question too. I think folklore is always being created. I think maybe it's hard to know at the time, and maybe it's something we'll only know or recognize with hindsight. I think folklore, the folk tales that survive now are probably just some of many, and there's something about what makes a particular tale stick and what makes it relevant still, maybe centuries later. Sometimes even thousands of years later. So I think there probably is. I mean, I definitely think there is. I think it's something that we can be part of creating, maybe. But again, yeah, maybe it's hard at the time to point to a certain thing and say this is going to be something that sticks, and this is something that's going to become part of our folklore and our heritage. But storytelling is absolutely still a living art, especially in Scotland. It's you can go to the storytelling centre. You should. You probably all have. And modern storytellers do make their own stories and incorporate aspects of older stories into new stories. And so I think it is a living art form. It's something that will never stop as long as there are people. And I think also what I said about science, I think often in science, we're using models to describe things, and that's not often very well understood, but what we're often describing with science is a model we use to explain it, what's going on, rather than directly explaining it, if that makes sense. Like, this is the model by which we understand it, and those models are often changing and evolving themselves. And so in a way, I think of them as a kind of folklore, in the sense that folklore often was a way of explaining something about the world. Many people at the time maybe often believed them to be true, and this is the same with our scientific models now. So maybe science in its own way is its own kind of modern folklore as well. Does that make sense? Yes?
Question from the bench high. Just keeping the mic. Thanks again for those reads. So just here more back to the science. Can you tell us a bit more about your transition from, you said, nuclear physics or astrophysics? Sorry.
Sorry, what was that? Could you repeat that?
So can you tell me a bit more about your transition from science, physics, to poetry? Were there always kind of something they have done in parallel? Is that something kind of you shifted? Is it something you're still reading about kind of science? Well, can you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. It's a bit of a mix. I started writing poetry when I was 8, and I had a really great teacher, which is often the case, I think, for many people. We have like a great teacher who inspires us, and he gave us the poem Lochinvar by Sir Walter Scott, and he asked us to memorize one verse of it, but I loved it so much that I went home that night, memorized the whole thing, and came back the next day and recited the whole thing, and he clearly saw that I liked that, and he gave me a different poem, a grown-up poem, every week to memorize and recite to the class. And I still remember so many of those poems even now, and I wrote to him when my first book was published, thanking him for that. And I started writing poems myself, with the confidence of an 8-year-old, like, yeah, I can do that. So Walter Scott can do it, I can do it. And as I got older, I became really inspired by maths and physics and astronomy, and ended up doing that at university. And I specifically didn't want to study poetry because I thought I might stop loving it if I did that. But I was always writing still. And then while studying, I did a Master's of Science, and when I was doing that, I realized it wasn't what I wanted to do forever. I love science, but I didn't want to do it as my job. And so I was sort of thinking, well, where do I go from there? And I did a bit of lots of different jobs. I was a teacher for a while, and then I ran an animal rescue for a while, and then I had children. And through it all, I was writing, and it wasn't until I had my children that I started, again, sending my work out, which I'd done when I was younger and sent it out to journals and magazines and things. And so that's when I started publishing my work. But actually, I did a lot of science-themed writing, especially space writing, and communication. I write a lot of sci-fi poetry. I really love sci-fi poetry, which is the most niche thing. If you're at all interested in getting paid, I cannot recommend it. But yeah, so that's kind of where I came sort of full circle back to writing into poetry. Yeah.
We have a few questions from online stream.
Yeah.
So the first one is, do you have a favorite character from Scottish folklore? If so, why?
Oh, that's such a good question. I have so many favourites, but one of my particular favourites are the 7 big women of Jura, who don't have their own story traditionally. They just sort of pop up in other stories where, you know, our hero has to go to like get something from Jura, and everyone's like, oh, but what about the big women? And then he's like, oh, I know, but I have to go. So these 7 kind of angry giantesses who live on Jura, and it's just sort of mentioned in passing, you know, it's like, who are they? And why are they there? So I reimagine them as this kind of polyamorous lesbian commune of big women who live on Jura. But yeah, so I think they might be one of my favourites. There's lots of really good giants in Scottish folklore, and the big women of Jura are probably my favourite, yeah.
And then there's one more question. What do you plan to write next?
Oh, well, I've been writing some picture books, actually, some like rhyming picture books for younger children, and I can't say too much about it, but I have exciting stuff in the works with that, with them becoming a real thing in the world. I've been writing some LGBT-themed picture books. The first one is actually about giants, and it's about giants and gay marriage. So I've been working on some of those, which is really fun. And I've been writing a lot of stories for younger children. So I've been working a lot with the Tonys, which is, they do stories for children that you can listen to either on an app or they have like a Tony's box that you can listen to. So I do a lot of work with them, and I write stories for them where you can go and listen to stories. So yeah, a bit of all of that. And I have also always been working on a collection of poems for grown-ups. So I have a few pamphlets of poems for grown-ups, but I have my full collection of poems, which I'm endlessly working on and never happy with.
Thank you for sharing, and I love the way that you read your poems.
Oh, thank you.
So I think it was in your introduction, you were talking about how folklore influences us, especially it's kind of one of our first encounters with art, and so it might kind of subconsciously influence us in the future.
Yeah.
And then I think you were talking about rewriting folklore versus rewriting versus writing other things, and you talked about starting with a blank canvas.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you more about that, because I would argue that like we never really start with a blank canvas. Like we always start with some intention, or we're always influenced by other things. Like, you know, creativity just kind of like bring different ideas together. So it's never really a blank canvas.
Oh, no, absolutely. I really agree with that there's not really such thing, like our minds themselves are not really blank, so we can't ever come to anything. We can't, and both in a good and a bad way, we can't kind of let go of our baggage and our biases when we come to create, but also we have our own ideas and our own wealth of kind of structure and things that we want to put into art. But I think at the same time, it can be really intimidating for many people to sit down in front of a blank page. And often when I'm working with writers in workshops, part of the reason they're there is that just sitting down with a piece of paper feels so intimidating, and it's hard to start. I think in a way it can feel like there's a pressure that it's hard to improve on the blank page because of the possibility that a blank canvas or blank page has. And so we want anything we write that we're then putting on that page, we think it's not going to live up to the potential that the blank page had. Does that make sense? So it can be intimidating in that sense. So I suppose that's what I mean by a blank canvas, having some structure. And this is why I quite like writing poems with a form to them, because it gives you some place to start and something to work with. But I totally agree that it's almost impossible to come to something with a completely blank idea. I think it's really beneficial to often start by as a writer, by just writing whatever's in your mind for 10 minutes, just to get it out of your mind so you can start accessing those kind of deeper reserves of creativity and get all that surface stuff out. Does that make sense?
One step further, what I liked about what you said about not necessarily feeling like you're starting with a blank canvas when you're rewriting folklore is that there's like a nice grounding to what you're doing, maybe more of a sense of purpose. And so I was just kind of trying to take that further and think that even when you are starting with a blank canvas, you can like use this idea of grounding your thoughts in something to actually kind of make it a little bit less intimidating.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
yeah.
So
We've all been exposed to art in many different ways, and absolutely draw on that when you're creating, and yeah, I think it's such a powerful thing. It's such a useful thing when we're creating.
Okay, we are out of time for questions, I'm afraid, but Rachel, thank you so much. I'm sure I speak
Thank
on
you for
behalf of
having me.
everybody. No, not at all. That was wonderful. And yeah, I mean, I'm feeling super inspired to write some stories of my own. Yeah, absolutely.
Do.
Thanks so much again, Rachel.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so just to round off for this morning, we are back again in April. Well, this is April, at the end of April. We're going to be back here in the Fruit Market Gallery again. We are going to be hosting in the cafe space for a little bit of a change up. And as ever, we always like to have a shout out for anything or anyone who's got anything interesting or any opportunities that they want to share in our community minutes slot. So that's a chance for you to come up here, and we give you 60 seconds or so to tell us about what's going on in your creative life, perhaps in your workplace, anything you want to share, anything you want to shout about. So if you'd like to do a community minute at our next event, please do get in touch by all the usual channels. And yeah, like I say, we will see you at the end of April. So without further ado, just to say a huge thank you to the Fruit Market again for hosting us. A massive thank you again to Rachel for such a wonderful talk and for such a rich and lovely Q&A as well. And a huge thank you to you for being here, and we will see you at the end of the month. Thank you so much.